Oh, hey, here's this. Oh, hey, thank you for your time. I appreciate you being here. This is Shooting from the Hip. Slim, how you doing?
Good. How are you doing?
I'm good. I'm very good. I'm looking forward to having this conversation, but before we do that, there's just something I need to cover first. So please keep in mind that what we are doing here, I'm Bet on It and Food for Thought and Shooting from the Hip. We explore human ideas, philosophies, noteworthy information. This exploration is us thinking aloud. It's a thought exercise. We're jumping in and out of ideas, examining and re-examining them. You will find we're prone to using like adult language and expressing heavily expressed opinions.
No fucking way.
Imagine that, eh? In keeping with that, you shouldn't believe anything that we say. Right? It's really important to keep that in mind. We are not experts of any kind. We're just having fun with these ideas and philosophies and information in the hopes that you will find it fun and interesting. We encourage you to invest time in searching out these subjects and come to your own conclusions. Now on with the shit show. And today's shit show, we are going to be covering ether, pneuma, prana, chi, ki, life force, piezoelectricity, and orgone energy. So I know this is a mouthful, but what you'll quickly realize in the course of the conversation that all these things could essentially be seen as the same thing. And the reason why there's so many different ways to refer to them because they come from multitude of cultures. So again, it's a rich part of human history, and so we're going to explore that and express as best as we can the fact that how common this thread is that runs through all of humanity. All right, so we'll start with pneuma. Pneuma is an ancient Greek word for breath, and in a religious context, think of it as like spirit or soul. So the pneuma is like air in motion, the breath, the wind. It's the animating force, right? That was the view. It's often seen as like psyche, or it represents that the quintessence or that animating force of the individual, and often associated with breath, right? Because we've discussed this, I think, before, that respiration is this because it's this common thread that all living things present, that it somehow is associated with the animating force. And then within most of these cultures and most of these ideas that revolve around respiration and breathing, that they've associated not just energy, but that you can refine that to a degree through breath practices, which we've in another episode covered more completely. So in India and in Indian medicine and martial arts, and yoga for that matter, it is known as prana. And prana is a Sanskrit word for breath or life force or vital principle, and it permeates all reality on all levels, including inanimate objects. So you can see where it is associated with energy. And so the prana is the yogic version of it, and yoga is the methodology by which you refine this animating force and energy. So you're going to see that's a common reoccurring theme, regardless of what part of the world that we look at where this idea is prevalent, which is virtually every culture on the face of the planet. All right, anything you'd like to add?
Yeah, and it's not like there's any specific thread drawing it from one to another place. It seems like each culture finds this on their own observation.
Right, so so that could be as a result of like it's just a common observation to make, but because how it's connected to this idea of an animating principle or an animating energy, it might be a stretch, but it could all come from one more common source. I'm not suggesting that it is. I'm just saying that because of how much commonality there is among it, it might be fair to say that. There's no evidence for it, at least not yet, not that we're aware of. So having said that, well, let's move on to qi or ki, and in the Chinese culture and East Asian culture, qi or ki, it literally means vapor, air, breath, and the word qi is often translated as vital energy, vital force, or material energy, or simply as energy. So it's a central underlying principle in in Chinese traditional medicine and Chinese martial arts, in Indian martial arts as well. That again, this idea that like somehow you can invest and refine the breathing process to produce a higher quality or higher content of energy within the individual, right? So, in more common parlance, it's often referred to as life force. That was a more common expression during like the 1800s that came into being. The force or influence that gives something its vitality or strength, the spirit or energy that animates all living creatures, right? So prana, chi, or life force energy, it gives the person an awareness and consciousness to experience living. The definition of life force is a concept of spiritualism, the energy and source of all life, the hypothetical principle that animates all living organisms. So we can see it as a sort of a theory that a concept that George Bernard Shaw, who I often quote in shooting Food for Thought. Sorry, excuse me. That he supported the idea that there is a vital force and an impulse that strives to attain greater power, contemplation, or self-realization. Right. So that was part of that that entire spiritualist movement of the 1800s, especially here in the West. It was a big thing in Western Europe and North America, right? And other ideas that are also affiliated and related to this idea of life force, breath, chi, energy, prana, pneuma. Ether, and ether is associated with the class, or it is one of the classic elements. And it's something that's been around. It's an ancient science. It was part of medieval alchemy. It was the way that they attempted to explain how things came into being, right? So, ether's also known as the fifth element. It's often referred to that, or the quintessence, the material that fills the region of the universe beyond the terrestrial sphere. And the classical elements typically refer to earth, water, air, fire, and then of course ether being the fifth one, right? And ether would be the substrate of everything, and then earth, wind, Wind and Fire, the band? No. Earth, water, air, and fire are the components that make up the reality we experience. So ether's the foundation for the reality. It's the thing that it's built upon, and then earth, water, air, and fire are the components that actually build the reality, right? So and if I've interpreted that incorrectly, please feel free to let me know. So in the 19th century, physicists postulated that ether permeated all throughout space, providing a medium through which light could travel. So right up until the early 1900s, it was an idea that was kind of accepted. Right now, it's in the infancy of like astrophysics and that sort of thing. So where they tried to, in a reductionist material science way, to try and explain or have a better explanation of reality and cosmology. But in terms of like a way to sort of talk about how this reality is structured, ether was this sort of catch-all phrase that kind of summed that up, even though they didn't know exactly what was there, right? Does it make sense so far, what I'm saying?
Yeah, it makes sense.
Okay. So the fifth element, Plato mentions it early on, and so it's been around since like the earliest foundations of human societies and civilizations. Within chi and ki and that whole thing, they have energy systems associated with the body, and that also goes hand in hand with yoga as well. And in China, they refer to it as dantian. Right now, you'll forgive me. I don't know how they refer to it in Japanese, but it translates as field of elixir, and it's described as the seat of the life force. So this seat of the ether, or the quintessence, or life essence, or energy, that it's part of these three energy systems within the human body. So there's one associated with the head and the chest, and then one in the base of your torso, right? So, and it's rooted in Taoist and Buddhist traditions, and it's related to higher states of consciousness. So we do know that there are in the traditions they do speak about how through breath work and forms of meditation that they're able to refine that, and it produces, again, these higher states of consciousness, or what might be referred to as like enlightenment. That it's a higher experience, and we're going to get more into that as we go deeper. So quintessence is that Latin name for the fifth element used by medieval alchemists for the medium, similar to identical to what makes up the heavenly body. So it was their way of sort of explaining what the stars, because again, they didn't have the benefit of where we currently are, like our level of understanding. So within the limits of the understanding was available at the time, that's how they referred to it, right? And air, it's funny, is one of the traditional classical elements, and in Chinese medicine, they have their own version of these classical elements, but there's more, when you hear them talk about them, it's more like they describe the process of one element changing into another element. So change is a part of that the whole their classical version of the elements, and they include in theirs metal and wood as classical elements, right? So you can see where they do kind of differ from one another, but essentially they are all referring to the same thing, that somehow there's an animating force, and that animating force is a substratum that makes up all things. So having said that, you can, in pop culture, Star Wars is very popular, and it uses the force, and the force is essentially a parallel of everything that we're talking about, right?
Yeah, and I thought it was interesting. There's always a sense of like the mental acuity you have of the force, and also the training you put towards it. Like, it's an enlightenment process.
You're right. So again, I would probably be no surprise to discover that George Lucas probably borrowed heavily from these ideas, and he was probably exposed to them in his youth, growing up in California, because we know, again, we do know that in terms of a center for things like Chinese Qigong, which is a form of moving meditation, and yoga. The state of California was a place where it first took its roots in North America, right? So he would probably had some exposure to it, and so then it's just an interesting play on it. There's all sorts of, within Chinese culture, they have these. I believe it's pronounced Wixia traditions, where it's a form of storytelling, where there are romantic fantasies, and there's lots of chi magic that's associated with the martial arts they're essentially the Chinese version of Jedi, way before Jedi. So that's why I say that he's probably borrowed heavily from that, and samurai as well. You can see where the parallels. But the idea that they can acquire these higher states of consciousness, which in at least in the fiction then leads to them having these fantastic abilities, right? So concepts such as life force and chi existed from antiquity. So they've been around, but there's been more modern interpretations of these very things, or attempts to explain them. So that brings us into the 18th century with somebody like Frank Mesmer, who ignited the debate with his theory of animal magnetism. Like, the attention to this vitalism grew up in the 18th and 19th centuries, and interested and continued into the 20th century, largely fueled by the adherents of the New Age movement. But it's an idea that's sort of like it's led to like the practices of hypnosis, which is done now like for entertainment purposes, but it's also used for therapeutic as a therapeutic tool as well. But when Mesmer introduced it, he referred to it as animal magnetism, and it was also known as mesmerism. And and it was given by again Frank Mesmer. So he believed it to be an invisible force, and he referred to it in German as Lebensnahmagnetismus. I hope I said that right. Possessed, it was possessed in all living things, including humans, animals, and vegetables. So, and he tried to, and made a very hard effort to try and scientifically validate what he was talking about. Unfortunately, he couldn't produce the kind of evidence that he wanted to support his position. But like I said, it did lead to the practices of hypnosis, mesmerizing, right? Like, so anyway, with science, so now that we're there and we're talking about, we've kind of covered all of these different ideas, talking about the same thing. You can distill it down to this metaphysical idea of energy, that it's like the source of all living things. Again, you can equate it to the fiction of the Force, right? But when you listen to reductionist material scientists talk about it, they don't talk about energy in the same way that, in the more common way that people express or discuss energy. Because for us, when we more commonly talk about it, we're referring to it in the metaphysical way. It's that animating force. It's that intangible element that provides like the impetus for living things, right? And for all of reality, for that matter. But when you hear them talk about it, they often it's often spoken of as a thing unto itself, like a region of glowing power that can be contained or used, right? So that's that perfect metaphysical explanation, and it actually fits when you think of the fictional idea of the Force and stuff like that. So it fits within that. But when the way that most materialist reductionist scientists, when they think of, when they use the word energy, for them, they're referring to a measurable work capacity, right? So that's, when they say energy, that's what they mean. So you could see very quickly how they would kind of view this as like really just, you know, childish fantasy, and nothing more than you know, just a flight of fancy, right?
Right, but since we don't know, we have to at least say we don't know. If there is an ether, we might not have to.
Or right, that there's something more substantial to reality beyond what's measurable, right? So, which again, it's fair to assume that it may very well be. My personal position is that I've always felt that like science and religion have failed to completely encapsulate the entirety of what reality is. That in fact, if they give us a glimpse, it's a glimpse to a small part of it. So they don't, and I'm not one of the faithful, so I don't subscribe to that kind of view of thinking. I like everything to be evidence based, but in lieu of evidence, I'm also open minded enough to go that, well, there's no proof against it either. So then you're kind of in this awkward place where now you're trying to make sense of this. But what you'll discover, though, as we move forward in the conversation, there'll be more and more, it'll be, I don't know that you can call it necessarily evidence, but it'll be substantial, like anecdotal accounts that will kind of point to something more significant, that maybe there is something, maybe there is somewhere between measurable capacity and this region of glowing power, that, you know, that this maybe there's somewhere in the middle there.
I have a question, but
Sure.
I think I'm going to be able to answer it myself
Okay.
later on.
Okay. Well.
I'm excited.
Okay. Right on. Okay. So we're gonna move forward with that. So shouldn't be any surprise then that these ideas have produced a mysticism, have grown up around these ideas then of like prana and pneuma and chi and ki, life force, quintessence, ether, whichever expression you choose to use. I like them all. That's why I keep saying them, because they're all actually kind of cool, right? But they all refer to the same thing, and so you could see where they all very quickly would lend to a mystical thinking and mysticism, which is not a religion in and of itself. It's kind of a spirituality, but and it's not necessarily magic in the way that most of us imagine or think of magic, but it's for at least in the 18th century and the 19th century, mystics and mysticism had more to do with this idea of that you could have a mystical union or a direct communion with the ultimate reality, right? And the ultimate reality could be interpreted as being like knowledge of God or some kind of ultimate spiritual truth, or or you have a subjective experience of the universe itself, right? So that was a common part of that whole mysticism. That was a form of entertainment in the 1800s. Think about that. It was predates television, so what people did to amuse and entertain themselves, it was reading. Newspapers were big, and then in the evenings, they didn't go to nightclubs and party. Not that they didn't drink or partake, but they sought out other forms of entertainment, and to them, things like seances and that sort of thing became a popular way of sort of like spending an evening, right? So it was popularly it's more popular referred to as some kind of like ecstasy or altered state of consciousness, which gives like a religious or spiritual experience or meaning to their day-to-day existence. And that you can see why there might have been an appeal there for that, right? So any questions?
No, that makes sense to me.
Okay, yeah. So as we're moving forward, right, and then while this is going on in the West, you have also these Eastern ideas which refer to like which revolve around like enlightenment as in terms of spiritual sense, that like somehow again that it's the same thing that the mystics were talking about, this union with the divine or the whole or all of reality. I can't presume to know what that is because I've never experienced it, but I find it again no less interesting, and whether it's just something that appeals to us on like some more basic level or there's some reality to it, that we're going to hopefully try and at least allude to something that maybe it's rooted in something more significant than just like, a desire for something more significant to reality.
I like to say it seems like something, if it's more fundamental than every other technique of measurement we have, like it's not within our physical space, like the substrata, the more fundamental thing,
Well,
we're only going to be able to like point around it kind of.
I understand what you're saying, that you can't actually talk about it directly. You almost end up having to talk about it in a roundabout way because you're trying to describe something that essentially you can't measure. So how do you describe it? But it's, to be fair, it's like trying to the concepts behind like atoms and electrons, neutrons, and protons, particles and waves from quantum physics. Like we discuss these things, but like how do people really conceptualize that, right? Like are they even capable of doing it? And how and to the average person, is that any less valid than talking about like a mystical union or wholeness or oneness or
mystical union? Like quantum physics is at a weird stage. Like there's weird things where people start to get mystical with it.
Yeah, but I think
whether it's unintentional or it's what is shown through objective observation.
I would agree that I think that even within mathematics, so you get to a certain place where now that number crunching leads to philosophical ideas because it gets to a point where now it's all theoretical. Like, for them, like, there's no way for them to, at least now under our current capacity, there's no way for them to prove or disprove what they're able to work out mathematically.
I think our interest in quantum physics means that like we are looking more into the substrata.
I think so too.
We never knew it was there.
Yeah, I think so then you could forgive these early ideas that they're like, hey, maybe they're not exactly on the mark, but they in part were correct in that there's something more to all of reality. And here's the significant part. And their view was that as an individual, that you could have a more direct experience of it.
Right. They had the practical application when you look at people who they found a sense of enlightenment.
Right. When you listen to physicists then talk about quantum physics, um, it's the mechanics of that, of what may be driving them that experience. So maybe in a super weird way, they're both kind of correct.
Right.
Again, I can't prove that, but it just seems to me that like there are places where they overlap. I'm sure that if you spoke to a physicist, they disagree. But in terms of our conversation, to us it seems not unreasonable.
Right. I wouldn't say you could necessarily attribute specific elements to parts of the universe, like water, fire. Like the properties and our interpretation of those things, it it just happens to characterize reality in a way that is
Relatable,
right. So they can approach it now.
right?
So it's very practical.
Yeah, so I think that's important because what's the point of all of this if it's not accessible? If the average person can't kind of wrap their head around it, I think that everybody should, even in a more basic way, should have some level of understanding of all this. Now, having said all that, um, now it leads us to I would like to we're going to take that dive into orgone energy. So that was all of that was the build up to come leading into orgone, and you know it's very controversial and often dismissed, but it's something that's worth at least hearing out the story behind orgone and Wilhelm Reich, and then you decide for yourself then like that if it's false or if there's any kind of credibility to it. So orgone was defined by Wilhelm Reich as a vital energy that he held pervaded nature, and it contributed to health in his theory. So orgone is considered a pseudoscientific concept described as esoteric energy or the hypothetical universal life force. So this does it again. It's somebody and just to be clear, Wilhelm Reich was practicing and implementing orgone energy and the use of orgone energy in the 50s. So these ideas have moved forward in time, and then you've had certain individuals who found ways to sort of try and access and implement them in a more broader sense. So the idea was originally proposed in the 1930s by Wilhelm Reich and developed by Reich's student Charles Kelly after Reich's death in 1957. Orgone was conceived as this anti-entropic principle of a universe, like the creative substratum. So
That
like
is interesting.
right, so
Anti-entropic.
right, because so if the universe is a constant state of entropy where it goes from order to chaos, then the cycle doesn't end with chaos. Then it would have to then go back to order. Does that seem like it would make sense? The yin and yang.
Yeah, it's like the equilibrium.
Right. So one can't exist without the other. So you don't have just chaos. Has to be some level of order within it. So
and they transmute into each other
right.
in some way.
All right. So then he postulated then that it was the anti-entropic property of the universe. That's what orgone is. Right? So one's decay and the other's rejuvenation, or however you would choose to characterize it. And he suggested that orgone was this massless, omnipresent substance, much like ether. Right? So like again, ether would be a parallel of it, that it wouldn't be incorrect to use ether and orgone interchangeably. So, but he associated more with the living energy than with inert matter, right? So he thought that perhaps it had to do more with living things than inert things like stones and minerals and stuff. But we know that in many of those traditions, they thought that it didn't matter what it was. All things were infused and were invested with this life force or ether, everything that it existed in everything.
Right, and William Reich didn't just suppose these ideas; he actually created things.
Right. He went as far as implementation, which we're going to get to. So, sorry, I jumped ahead there. Okay, so So there's some who've considered, and they were supporters of Wilhelm Reich, that maybe what he had discovered is something that he rediscovered in ancient science from that earliest times, right? Because the ideas have been around since we've organized into civil societies and civilizations. That in one shape or another, one form or another, these ideas were present, and that maybe his discovery was not actually a discovery as much as they say a rediscovery, something that was already there.
Yeah, most theologies have something like along these lines. And if you look at alchemic drawings, it seems at least there's this idea in a certain period of time where they thought it was so real they could learn and act with it, even if you don't agree with transmutation, these things.
Right.
But they at least, there are people out there who at least saw something that they dedicated themselves to.
Right.
Whether they're snake oil salesmen
or not, but clearly there was an investment that maybe they thought there was some value in this idea, and I think what you'll discover is as we move forward through this material, that Wilhelm Reich absolutely did. He capitalized on something. He did manage to make something of interest. Now, having said that, we consider the discovery of orgone energy among the greatest events in human history, from a letter signed by 17 medical doctors in 1949. That was the endorsement that he got because of the work that he was doing, which we're gonna get into, but we're leading up to it. So I'm sorry for the pacing, but you're gonna the idea is to keep you hooked, right? So this was in 1949, and he was taken to prison in March of 1957 for daring to use life force to heal people. And it was actually the FDA that were trying to shut down his cancer quackery, as they called it, right? Because what he was doing was he was resolving cancer for cancer patients. So the United States Food and Drug Administration, the FDA or the USDA, US FDA, is the federal agency and Department of Health and Human Services. It's responsible for protecting and promoting public health through control and supervision of food safety, tobacco products, dietary supplements, prescriptions, over-the-counter pharmaceuticals, medications, vaccines, biopharmaceuticals, blood transfusions, medical devices, electromagnetic radiation emitting devices, cosmetics, animal foods, and feed and veterinary products. So they basically give the rubber stamp to everything that's consumable for living things, right? That which includes medicines to like foods in themselves. The FDA was trying to solicit plaintiffs against Wilhelm Reich, like as to use as a fraud case, and they went to dozens and dozens of his patients trying to find somebody who would complain about become a complainant against him and his methods. They couldn't find one, not a single one, because they all said that his therapy helped them. Right? So they got him on contempt of court charges. This is how they managed to do it. So at that time, he was working in Maine. He had this facility that was like a rural facility of his own. And they bring people to, and he'd treat them. So the circuit courts of Maine sent a cease and desist letter for his treatments. He wrote back to the court stating, "My methods to be judged by a group of scientific peers and not by a bunch of lawyers."
Oh, I love that.
Yeah. Boy, you go because he was a smart guy, smart enough to know this is the only way to validate what he was doing is he needed his peers to support his work. But on the basis of the letter, they charged him with contempt of court. So agents came out to his laboratory in Rangeley, Maine, and they went into his laboratory and confiscated 2 truckloads of papers, notes, books, research, and took them all to an incinerator, had them all burned. And then they went into his laboratory and went in with sledgehammers and smashed all of his equipment. And so this is not, and so In 1957, there's a quote from the judge who was presiding over his trial. His name was John D. Clifford, and he stated orgone energy does not exist.
Oh, did they find proof that it doesn't exist?
Well, he destroyed it all.
Oh,
Imagine
I
that,
knew
eh?
it, huh?
Right? So the court ruling was the one that actually had all his journals banned, all his work banned, and sent to incinerators and burned. Reich was also sent to federal penitentiary where he died. Okay, so this was a ruling of Judge D. Clifford. Orgone energy does not exist, or you might say the life energy does not exist. So basically, what he was doing was denying all these traditions that like it was all bullshit, it's all fallacious, and that you're a snake oil salesman. Except he couldn't find anybody that he had treated who would speak out against him.
In my opinion, that's actually support for his case.
Well, I think yes, it makes that point that it was effective.
Even in a neutral situation, you're going to find complainers. If nobody complained, I assume there was benefit to each of them.
Yeah. So when you think about what was going on at that time, here's this outlier now who's basically going against the grain, but his own peers were seeing the value of what he was doing. Remember, he had 17 of them who endorsed what he was doing. They were like, "There's something to this," right? And they completely ignored that. So it's the culture of the time. It's the people of the time, and to describe them as being ignorant is probably fair. And so this judge acted clearly by the statement he made, he acted completely out of ignorance. And then I'm sure he slept with a guilt-free conscience, thinking he was protecting the good people of the United States of America.
Right. But who, or not who specifically, but he was pinned as a snake oil salesman. So of course.
Well, because what did he state? That there's no such thing as orgone energy. And you go like, well, who's he to make the final decision? I mean, other than the fact that he's a presiding judge, right?
Right.
But again, he assumed that his authority gave him absolute discretion to speak about something that he knew nothing about.
Right.
And why do you think Wilhelm Reich said that? Here, I'll be judged by a jury of my peers, not lawyers. Bring my peers in, and I'll convince all of them.
I simply think the fact that they've vilified him right out.
Well, because it was the easiest way to shut down what he was doing.
Yeah.
Imagine that. So that means in the 1950s, he could have introduced a form of cancer treatment that, based on what little information there is, that we wouldn't hear in the future, all the deaths that occur as a result of cancer, and I believe we did discuss this at length during one shooting from the hip.
Oh, and it's very costly to buy the medication
Right.
too.
So imagine, here he found a method of treatment that was probably not expensive, that essentially you couldn't corner the market on, right? That he made it accessible to people, and they simply destroyed him. So he'll join that list of other really brilliant minds who just couldn't compete with the common narrative of the time. So think of Nikola Tesla as well, right? He's another one, an outlier who was doing stuff in an innovative and actually maybe was presenting an even deeper understanding of what was going on, and could have liberated us in a significant capacity, and then all it took was closed minds to destroy him. So again, the importance of why, to question everything and to question yourself. Don't presume that you're infallible, and that your position is somehow beyond reproach, right? It's that kind of thinking that destroyed these individuals who could have been created a critical turning point in the development of our societies. So if you don't like the ills of the world that we currently experience, if these people were allowed to fulfill what they were doing, it could have represented a game changer, right? So it shouldn't. Everybody should immediately appreciate the tragedy in that.
When I'm losing at Monopolies, I also flip the board.
Yeah, a very childish maneuver for a game player, right? But think who might have been. You can't say with any certainty, but this judge might have been influenced heavily. Again, it was the FDA, and the FDA is tightly associated with the pharmaceuticals, and the pharmaceuticals were a significant part of the the healthcare system, even in the 50s. So you imagine what they thought, like they would stand to lose suddenly, and they were like not having it. So again, self-interest, self-motivated individuals have shaped the development of society at the expense of everyone else. It's really clear. You need to be clear about this. That means that there's some people decided that their ability to generate profit was more important than everyone else. And again, I'm not anti-capitalism. Because that needs to be said to be clear, right? But that kind of piracy, that kind of like cutthroat capitalism, it's not healthy, right? Agree, disagree?
Totally agree.
Yeah.
I love capitalism, but one thing I hate is it's not
Crony capitalism.
it's not sustainable. Wanting improved returns every year.
What?
At some
Yeah,
point, your product isn't going to improve, and you're not going to have more customers.
it makes you wonder what they're thinking. But to me, it's clear they're not. They don't care.
It seems like rigging a market for financial value.
Right, 100%. So, what he was doing then was shut down, and so in that 2 years he was in prison, his son Peter ended up writing a book in the 70s about his father called A Book of Dreams, and cloud busting was inspired by the book. So everyone knows who Kate Bush is because of Stranger Things, Running Up That Hill. Remember that song?
Yeah.
Well, she wrote, at that time, there was another song that she had put out, and it was called Cloud Busting, and it was based on Wilhelm Reich's son, Peter, writing this book about his father. And so part of the Argonne thing, he created these machines that he claimed could dissipate clouds. All right, so you can see, again, you can see where people might go, come on, that's like, can't be real, right? I'm not claiming one way or the other. I'm just saying that here it's super interesting that all of this is happening at that time, right? And then you have this, this hit song in 1985 that's based on what he was doing, and the song's called Cloud Busting by Kate Bush, right? So, and it was inspired by it's not autobiographical, but it's the book that his son wrote to honor his father, right? So in the extraordinary account of a life and confidant and friend, child of the brilliant persecuted Austrian psychoanalyst Wilhelm Reich, Peter's son shared with his father the revolutionary concept of a world where dream and reality were virtually indistinguishable, and the sense of mission which set him and his followers apart from the rest of the human race. Here Peter writes vividly and movingly of the mysterious experiences he shared with his father, of flying saucers, cloudbusters, rainmakers, and the FDA narcs, and the final tragic realization of his father's death. So again, all this stuff, it really is sad that how it all almost always ends, and it's with the premature death. It's just something that didn't need to occur in the way that it did occur, right? So just to give make it a little more like now to give it a little more kind of gravitas, we're going to do it like this timeline where we're going to explore Wilhelm Reich's life, right? So this I think, I'm hoping that everyone will find this sort of interesting. I'm just simply going to read it, right? And so then if you feel like there's a question you have or something, you can just interject at any point, right?
All right.
Okay, so in 1897, he's born in Austria, March 24th, to Jewish parents. Father was a prosperous farmer. Grandfather was also a farmer, and he was raised in a secular household, but taught the Old and New Testaments from a scientific and historic perspective. Right. So anyone who doesn't know what secular is, all it means is that it has no religious or spiritual basis to their kind of the way they approach, but they had an awareness of the Old and New Testament, and they did explore it, but more. Think of it more as sort of like exploring their culture, and less to do with the absolute truth of what reality was. It was more sort of something to have an awareness of, but not to allow that to influence their thinking. That their thinking should be informed by science and what can be proven. Right?
Almost like the family looked at themselves and kept it separate from society, but looked at society.
Well, yeah, but in that very household, it was a household that was that leaned heavily on science and history, but had an awareness of the Old and New Testament, so the Jewish Torah and the Christian Bible, right? So they had an awareness of these things, but they didn't allow for that to inform their decision making. Their decision making came out of like something a little more substantial, right? Okay, so in 1903 to 1907, instructed privately at home, so he was homeschooled. 1907 to 1915, he attended a German high school and graduated with high marks in Greek, Latin, and natural sciences. In 1914, his father dies. Wilhelm takes over running the farm until it is destroyed by fire in the onset of World War I in 1915. In 1916, until the war's end, he serves as a lieutenant in the Austrian army on the Italian front. So this is a guy who, like, think about what this guy is. Brilliant. Must have had enough courage then, at least, to be able to be a participant in the First World War, and he served on the Italian front, and he served for the entire duration of the war. It's like he already the type of person he is. You go, perhaps there might be something to what he was saying. Now, I'm not suggesting because he served his country and because he was brilliant that somehow that validates everything he was saying. But if you bear it out, you'll find it most interesting. And then in 1922, he obtains an MD degree and becomes a clinical assistant to Freud's psychoanalytical clinic in Vienna.
That's so cool.
Is that wild? Right? And then in 1924, he becomes a director of the Vienna Seminar for Post-Analytical Therapy, in which the capacity serves until his departure from Vienna. In 1930, he moves from Vienna to Berlin. In 1933, the Nazis attempt to imprison Reich for his writings and lectures on psychological basis of fascism. He escapes to Denmark and the publication of Character Analysis. So he's speaking out against the Nazis. And so then he's like, oh God, I'm in trouble, I gotta go, right? Like, so does this sound like a guy who's prone to, who's going to become a snake oil salesman?
He sounds like a stand-up guy.
Yeah, I kind of get that impression. 1934 to 1936, under pressure from Nazi Denmark, they expel him. So, because the Nazis assume authority in Denmark, so they're like, you got to go. And he relocates to Oslo, Norway, and conducts studies and experiments involving bioelectrical potentials in living organisms in response to changing stimuli. 1939, he discovers life energy as an outgrowth of his Oslo work. He names it orgone. Accepts an associate professorship at the New School for Social Research in New York City, United States of America. 1940, he invents the orgone accumulator. In 1942, he purchased 280 acres farm near Rangeley, Maine. In 1946, the publication of the Mass Psychology of Fascism is translated into English and relocates his permanent research to Rangeley, where he constructs a laboratory and establishes an institute he calls Organon. In 1947, the medical establishment begins a campaign to discredit Reich and his work. The FDA becomes involved and begins spying on him. And then in 1950, the Oranur experiment invents a cloudbuster, begins a series of weather modifications experiments. And this is 1950 to 52. In 54, Reichs witnesses UFOs in the vicinity of his farm or realizes a connection between UFO phenomena and Oregon energy principles. Reich is brought to trial on various charges, including accusations of fraud. In 1956, Reich is sentenced to 2 years in prison for contempt of court. All Reich's equipment and laboratory are destroyed under the supervision of the Federal Food and Drug Administration. All of his research papers, writings, test results, literature are loaded into trucks and taken to an incinerator and burned. So he could have given access to his stuff. He could have made his case. He had decades worth of research to be able to make a case, and they basically buried him.
If anything, they should have kept the evidence to disprove him, but I feel
Well,
like you burn it because there's proof.
Right, because it would validate him, right? And so
it's very upsetting hearing that.
Well, but this is the reality you live in. Look,
Right.
The reality we live in is somebody's narrative. It's somebody else's narrative. It's not yours. And then what you're expected to do is to toe the line. And then people who don't conform, non-conformists, what happens?
Book burning.
Right? So it's in the strangest way, you go like, we're surrounded by fascists. And they're not like overt fascists. It's just that behavior that you'd expect out of fascists, and yet it's being conducted by people who they would tell you how open-minded and loving and caring they are. And the question becomes, are they? Are they really? Right, here you go. How much more do you need to hear before you realize that, okay, so maybe he was seeing UFOs and stuff like that. So, but that doesn't mean that the guy was like a basket case. You look at the credibility of his education and his history, and you go, this is a guy who's clearly not prone to being childish and silly and following silly diversions. He was somebody who was serious.
He definitely took a very analytical approach, which I assume came from his. They sound more objective, like his parents, and the way he was educated.
Well, because he was homeschooled in the thinking like where you root everything in science and you look at history, because history again reveals patterns of behavior, so you can start to see things. So here we are, stuck here in the present. Pardon me. Here we are stuck in the present, and we're still bombarded and subjected to all these things. And again, I would ask you for a moment to pause and to think and consider, had things gone differently and his work was validated, how radically different would contemporary society look? Right? Just something for a moment, just take a moment. Right? It wouldn't be the world that you're living in right now. Right? So that means there's forces at work that have been steering and directing the evolution of our civilization, our society, for very specific private interest. And they don't care about any of us. What they care about is what they care about. So they're driven by their own self-interest, and that produces an agenda. And this could be seen as part of that agenda in a peripheral kind of way. It's not like they have this specific. Maybe they do. It's not like they're adhering to a specific plan and executing the plan. But any outliers like this, they squish them and get rid of them because they're a threat. They represent a potential threat. And once the cat's out of the bag, they can't. There's nothing they can do to stop it. So they try to neutralize it before it can gain the momentum it needs to overturn anything.
I think they accidentally pushed his momentum forward.
Well, what?
It could have gone further, but it's not like he was. He's not hidden from history.
No, the only good thing about it is that we know that he existed. But the downside is we never knew the specifics of his work, and so that's the tragedy, right? Because if we had all of his work to pore over, we might be able then to discern exactly what he was doing, and then be able to reproduce it.
We would at least have a perspective where science isn't the ultimate answer, it's a process of finding.
Right.
Like eventually, there's understanding that you have, but there could always be more, and I think that's the model.
Well, we should be constantly striving for greater levels of understanding, for greater grasp of what we are experiencing in this thing that we call reality. So in 1957, he finally dies after 2 years in prison in Danbury Penitentiary in Connecticut. Um, who instigated all the proceedings against him? That's unknown. But other than the obvious, which is the FDA, but the FDA, again, they're closely affiliated with, so many institutions that his work might have been a threat against. I'm not suggesting that they did it, but it wouldn't. Again, I'll say it for public record. It wouldn't surprise me one bit to discover that, that they had their finger in it. The pharmaceutical industry and the institutions that existed at the time that were using like a mainstream form of treatment. Look, cancer treatment is largely the same as it was back in the 50s, right? They use radiation to fend it off, and there's not been any real significant advancements in treatment. It's not that they haven't had alternative treatments or tried different things, but it's essentially the same form of treatment without significant variation in that treatment. Doubt me? Just take a simple look into it. You might be surprised by what you discover, right? And again, I'm not pointing fingers at anyone. I'm just simply saying that when profit is the primary concern, why would they want any kind of innovative thinking that would threaten the ability to generate revenue, especially something that produces a high revenue stream, right? So it's not unimaginable that they would act to protect the very revenue stream. I'm not saying that they did. I'm just simply saying that it's not inconceivable that something like that would occur. All right, so by the time he got to his release from prison, he was almost at the end of the 2 years, and then he died. He did, in fact, die in his prison cell. Right, so
How old was he again when he died?
oh, I don't have an exact age. I can't remember.
I'm curious if he was.
Well, he was born in 1897. He died in 1957. So let's see, that's it would have been like 58, something like that. Is that right? Or maybe 61.
That's a reasonable age. He is getting up there. I'm just curious.
Well, it's clear that he had a whole life, right? Like, so, and when you look at his timeline, you go like, this is a guy who really lived, and it doesn't strike me as the kind of person that was prone to like, flights of fancy. This was a guy who seemed really rooted in the real world. That, and so the fact that something like this occurs and probably keeps occurring is kind of shameful, right? So because this again, he represents the kind of individual that would have moved society forward in a very significant way, especially if there was truth to his work. But we'll never know because we don't even have the ability to go through his research to see if it was full of shit or if there was value to what he was doing. And of course, the suspicious side of me is like there probably was a lot of value in what he was doing, right? Now, having said that, the average person could build an orgone generator or an accumulator, because all an orgone accumulator is, the key is layering. And so if you could build a box and you layer galvanized steel on the outer shell and steel wool as a layer, and then fiberglass layer, and you would alternate the steel wool and the fiberglass layers, right? And you would put it in a wooden frame, and the inner shell would be like a soundboard or Celotex, right? So and the more layering that you have, the better and more effective the accumulator. At least based on, remember, because some of the work that he was doing, he had a protege, so that he was promoting the work after he died. But
sorry, as a tangent, I'm kind of curious if that has anything to do with like the ionized energy in the air? Because if you think,
It's not my specialty. I don't know.
me neither. I'm just curious because I think there's a net positive charge in the air. Like it's not
Well,
significant, but
the way I understand it is that it would draw ambient energy, so it's the energy that's available. And so I don't want to use the word 0 point, but it's like energy from nothing. It's not that there's nothing, because within every cubic centimeter of air and space, there's potential energy, right?
So I'm assuming it could be the potential draw of just what's out there, but an actual generator of orgone energy that, you know, if it does come from what we call nothing, or maybe the substrate of it, that would be a very, very interesting find.
Well, so for those of you who are industrious, to be able to build an accumulator, I just gave you the kind of breakdown, but really the meat of it is the alternating material. So steel wool and fiberglass, because one's a mineral and one's organic material, right? So and so it's metal and silicate layering, right? So and the more layering you have, the better it is. So for any of you out there who are so inclined, let me know how it worked out. So the silicate is a salt or an ester derived from silic acid, especially any of the numerous insoluble complex metal salts that contain silicon and oxygen, and constitute the largest class of minerals and are used in building materials such as cement, bricks, and glass. Right? In some cases, they would use an organic material and an inorganic material to create the dielectrics, to create this potential differences like a capacitor. And a dielectric is a substance that is not a conductor of direct electrical current. A dielectric is an insulator rather than a conductor. And a dielectric permits the passage of the lines of force associated with the electromagnetic field. So it has something to do with the electromagnetic field and does not conduct the current. So capacitor is an electrical component that stores potential energy. Capacitors hold positive and negative energy on two separate plates separated by the insulator. So this thing becomes an energy storage, and then if you get in it, then you're within this field of this thing that basically is an energy storage system. And so then that's where the speculation is that's where the physical healing would occur as a result of like being exposed to this electromagnetic field, right? So the ancient science of orgonomy. In 1940, Reich invented a way to concentrate the orgone energy, and he constructed an orgone accumulator, a box whose walls, floor, and ceiling consisted of several layers of alternating organic and metallic materials. Observation experiments have shown that the organic materials attract and collect orgone from the atmosphere, and the metallic materials attracts and repels orgone. Thus, the organic layers of the accumulator attract and soak up orgone, and the metallic layers draw it from the organic material and rate it into the interior of the accumulator. So then you would therefore get into the accumulator, and then it would have this positive health benefit, right? So you go like, it's kind of trippy.
The idea of a field generator, that reminds me of Tesla's work, actually.
Well, so that's what I mean. So they're not that far removed. And he represents another person that, as much as he's ignored, overlooked, or just condemned as being like a madman.
He made the first RC boat. I think he's brilliant.
Dude, he's absolutely brilliant. But, you know, moneyed interests were the ones that basically doomed him. So why is it so hard to believe that it was, again, moneyed interests? J.P. Morgan did it. And he claimed the breach of contract, and then basically, you know, sunk him into obscurity, and eventually he died a broke person. And then the FBI moved in and grabbed, I think he had 80 boxes of research, and they turned over only 60 boxes to his family and kept 20. Well, it was probably the most significant parts of his research, right? So it's just, again, it clearly we sometimes forget our own history, and you don't have to go this far back. This is not ancient history.
Forgetting history, I think, is the biggest issue we have recently.
Well, because it's so easy, because we're so lost, right? We get caught up in our material needs for our existence that we're easily manipulated because of that. And then if you think about it, like, we end up seeking pleasure because we have these meaningless existences, right? And what Wilhelm Reich and Nikola Tesla represented was the ability to maybe change the face of the average individual's life in a radically and dramatic kind of way, where people wouldn't have to be so concerned about material gain. What if you had suddenly all the energy that you required to do anything that you wanted to do, and it was freely available?
You can't buy that persona. Like, you can buy entertainment, you can be happy, but you cannot buy what these people were.
Right. So what we've become a society that substitutes pleasure for any kind of meaning, or the pursuit of any kind of meaning, and and then people get lost in that.
I think it's interesting that he used organic matter in the layering process. I'm curious how he came to that.
Well, we'll never know.
Yeah.
But like I said, his protege and stuff. If you did a much deeper dive, I'm sure you could get into the specifics of it. And we're not. That's not what we're here to do. I'm not into
Right.
But we're into exploring.
For the love of God, if anybody makes one,
let me know. Please
Yes.
do. Please reach out. I would happily bring you onto the show, but only after I get to step into the accumulator and Slim too.
I don't think it fixes bad personality.
Oh, damn! Looks like I'm done.
Oh, I didn't mean that. No, not about you, man. You're sweet. Don't worry.
Oh, thanks, dude. Okay, so something interesting about the topic that we're on. So, what is significant about this is that there was a book written by John Ivimi. I hope I'm saying that correct, right? And in 1975, and it was called The Sphinx and the Megaliths. And excavating under the directions of Professor R.J.C. Atkinson in the last few years had revealed many details previously unknown about the methods of construction of places like Salisbury Hill. That pyramid was not built in a way one might expect in a Stone Age, by Stone Age Aboriginals to have built it. It was by simply digging a ditch and shoveling material into a heap in the middle of a field, right? Like children building a sandcastle. In fact, it was far from that. Salisbury Hill was this complex piece of engineering involving advanced methods of construction similar to those used in the Egyptian pyramids. For the main part of the hill, the material dug from the ditch was laid symmetrically in horizontal layers. So they would layer it as they built the hill. Are you familiar with Salisbury Hill?
Not at all, actually.
Okay, so it's a giant earthwork, and it's a megalithic structure. So it's a combination of stone, and then they just and earth used to create like essentially a tower in the middle of a field.
Would this by chance be near like the Snake Pass or Snake Hills they made?
I
think it's
I couldn't say. I really couldn't say. Sorry. I wish you had. Sorry, I could help you out with that. But this is what's significant and interesting about that. That it was the methods of construction were similar to those used in Egypt for the pyramids. And the main part of the hill, the material dug from the ditch was laid symmetrically, on the outer edges, and riveted by means of sloping retaining walls made of large blocks of chalk. And so Salisbury Hill is a prehistoric artificial chalk mound near Avebury in the English countryside of Wiltshire. It is part of Stonehenge, and Avebury and associated sites are UNESCO World Heritage Sites. So it's about 39 meters tall and 129 feet. And it's the tallest prehistoric man-made mound in Europe and one of the largest in the world, similar in size to the Pyramid of Menkaure and the Giza Pyramid complex in Egypt. Salisbury Hill is in part of a Neolithic monuments around Avebury. Right? So the interesting thing about that is on the Mounds and Relics of the Ancient Nations of the Americas, a book from 1846. And it appeared in the American Journal of Science. These they were commenting on the mounds, and the habits of the builders were laid, that the developments are wonderful. They satisfied himself on the mounds. Many may be sepulchres relating to the tomb, or intermittent sepulchre monuments, other sacrificial, others for lookout alarm posts. So what the merely sepulchre piles on earth, mounds thrown up at first may seem random, but the arrangement of the materials that covering the altars were artificially stratified. So what they would do is they very specifically do what Wilhelm Reich was doing. An inorganic layer, and an organic layer, an inorganic layer. And so they stratify the layering over alternating beds of gravel, earth, and sand. And by following in the common curvature, like they build it up, right? And so what they had essentially creating was an orgone accumulator, right? And they were doing it in the ancient past. So it speaks to then what these ancient earth mounds and things like the pyramids, that what they might have been is part of, again, it kind of suggests that they were part of like an energy system, and an energy system that used organic and inorganic materials and the right layering to create this like capacitor or an energy storage, magnetic fields. And this isn't like, Stone Age past, right? Or what we refer to, or what more commonly is referred to as the Stone Age, right? So the fact of stratification in these mounds is one of the greatest interests, and is important. The stratification so far observed is horizontal, but always conforms to the convex outline of the mound. So they would literally do it like that. So they would be the top and the sides. They would layer it. So that's a box. Or it doesn't matter if it's conical or whatever. It's essentially a box, right? Like, so
container, absolutely.
Right. So here's the real sticking point, that on both sides of the ocean, and at least in terms of cursory examination, you see that these earthwork structures bear similar internal architecture, and that they were doing what Wilhelm Reich was doing. So you go like, what were our ancestors aware of? How much were they truly aware of? And were they more sophisticated than we imagined them to be? Right? Maybe they didn't know. Maybe it's a remnant from an even earlier time. We can't say with absolute certainty, but this is a place where we entertained wild ideas and speculation. So
it could be that there's just some representative. There's something represented in the way they built it, possibly. But supposing the orgone energy is real, we have lost something. At some point, we have lost something.
So, and then maybe Wilhelm Reich just simply rediscovered it, and could have potentially had society and civilization changing consequences. So maybe we would have never had to endure the I was going to say we might not have to have had to endure World War II, right? But
or any war over oil.
So imagine that, eh? But remember, all that stuff is because we think that all energy is a result of like extracting oil from the ground, and it's a requirement. Here, we could find a way to do it for free, but when it's for free, how do the wealthy make profit from something that's free, or that's naturally reoccurring? And all you have to do is find a way to tap into it. And here's the method. Perhaps this is the method, right? And it's the thing that's been hidden from us for, well, at the very least 100 years, right? Or almost 100 years. So it's kind of shameful. Again, how else would you describe that kind of behavior? You go like,
disappointing, just very disappointing.
Well, because it demonstrates just how selfish certain portions of the population can be, And it's sad. You go like, how many people died needlessly, are unnecessary? We're all gonna pass, but the question is it a senseless, pointless death? And did you have the ability to have a long and natural existence? Right? And I go, so people like Nikola Tesla and Wilhelm Reich, and what we see in these earthworks and things going on in Egypt at that time, that this was the ability to liberate not just a few of us, but all of us. And a few of us decided it was not in their interest for that to occur. And so then they did everything they could to prevent it. Now, I can't prove that. So when I say that, take it with a grain of salt. Right? I can't prove any of what I'm saying. All I'm doing is presenting it because I'm fascinated and interested by it, and I think it's worthy of at least consideration, or at least discussion. And then you decide for yourself whether or not I'm just a madman or just whatever. Okay, so I think that kind of like I think we're kind of that kind of wraps up Wilhelm Reich. So the last thing I want to cover is piezoelectricity. All right, and but before we do that, can I get a quick time check?
Yep, 1 hour and 16 minutes in.
Okay, so I think okay, our pacing's good. I think the timing's good. We can cover piezoelectricity rather comfortably, and everything that from the moment we start this conversation leading up to now is really about. It's going to tie it all together very nicely, right? So. So when we start with piezoelectricity, to define it, it's the electrical charge that accumulates in certain solid materials such as crystals, certain ceramics, and biological matter such as bone, DNA, and various proteins in response to an applied mechanical stress. Right? So any of those people who own a watch and you shake the watch, the action of shaking, there's two crystals internally in the watch, and the action of shaking is the mechanical pressure. The squeeze puts pressure on the crystal, and the crystal generates charges the watch. All right, so if you're all curious about where there's a practical or an everyday kind of ambiguous kind of or incidental kind of application of it.
Oh, and also because of the physical orientation, like the lattice within the crystal, it transfers these potential energies. Because you think about like a diamond, like the shape of a diamond.
The multifacets.
It changes shape. That way it oscillates.
Right.
It oscillates the net charge from one side to the other.
Okay, excellent. Thank you for that.
No problem.
Okay, so the word piezoelectricity means electricity resulting from pressure and latent heat. It is derived from the Greek word piezein, which means to squeeze or press, and electron, which means amber, an ancient source of electrical charge. Right. So I think it's kind of interesting that this is a common effect that exists, and that's used in a kind of like, again, in an incidental kind of way. Like although think about transistor radios was part of that. I think with the computer, the circuit boards for computers. So it's kind of everywhere, even though most of us are completely oblivious to it, right? So so then think about those aggregate stones, and in places like where there's earthquakes and earth movement, and the kind of pressure that's put on those aggregate stones, and then what are they doing? They release potential energy.
Oh, can you clarify the term aggregate stone?
Okay, aggregate stone is a stone made up of like minerals and then crystal deposits. So they're a mix of mineral and the crystals that we're talking about, right? So aggregate stone, granite's an aggregate stone. So that, most of the megalithic sites, they're aggregate stones. They're mostly made out of granite or bluestone, which is another aggregate stone. They're very hard stones, but it's a mix of mineral and crystal, right? So then under pressure, what would these things do? Release some form of energy.
They would conduct it because of the actual minerals within too.
Right, and then all you would need is a mechanical pressure. So if you're having an earthquake, so then how much of an energy release would that produce? Right. Well,
Who knows?
Well, I don't know. That we're just asking the question, right?
Right. That would be so interesting, though. Somebody finds that aggregate stones can conduct mechanical pressure into some more generally, I don't know, a field of electricity, like
Right.
magnetism, let's
Right.
say.
Okay,
Quartz
so
itself has interesting properties, but not adding it to stone, aggregate stones come naturally.
right, so
Just to have it
they're
there.
naturally occurring. You don't have
Very
to create it, right? You know, and then all these megalithic sites are made up of that. So you go like so then the beyond the explanation that they're ritual sites. Well, if we know that piezoelectricity might be a part, and the stones that were chosen were not accidentally chosen. That's why the entire site is made up of these aggregate types of stones. That means that maybe they had an awareness that it would create a certain kind of field of energy.
It's just baffling. Like, how much energy could you get out of that? Like,
I
the
don't.
idea. It's amazing.
But wouldn't it be worthy of research and exploration?
Right.
Right? Isn't that what Wilhelm Reich was doing?
It-
Right, because when you think about the orgone accumulator, isn't that essentially what he was doing? Like the aggregate stone that's made up of crystal and mineral deposits. So it's organic and inorganic material, right? Because crystal's often referred to as a living thing, right?
It's like a capacitor. It
Right.
holds and releases at certain
Okay,
intervals.
okay. So maybe this thing was part of the lexicon of early human history, or maybe comes from that epoch in human history from about 20,000 years ago, where everything's really vague. We don't have a really good idea what was going on. So then that might mean then that all these megalithic sites are remnants of an energy system that predates the cultures that have been traditionally credited for creating them, right? Because we can't measure the stones with any kind of accuracy because there's no way to date them, right? Especially the ones that are that are part of megalithic sites. There's no way to specifically date it. Although the earthbounds you could take a core sample from like as deep into the base layer and then find organic material, and then you could get you can approximate date, but I don't see them going another way because largely because most of those earthen mounds are indigenous heritage sites. So you're not allowed to you're not allowed to actually do that kind of invasive kind of research on them, right? Again, understandably, but having said that, that might at least give us an indicator of just how far into the past they might come from. So what if they came from in excess of 15,000 years ago, and it was part of something that again defies our imagination, that literally, like when you think of it, then it would be the equivalent to something right out of science fiction.
Right, because our dating methods aren't absolute.
No, even under the best conditions, and you can't accurately date stone. So what they do is they try to find like organic material underneath the stone at its base layer, and then go, well, then this organic material was there when the stone was erected. So then you might be able to get, and again, it's just an approximate date, right? So there's no way of getting an accurate absolute date. So having said that, so we find this super interesting that like the electrical fields that are produced by this piezoelectricity, it makes you wonder to what end would they have these in these sites? Is it energy transmission for the use of the energy, or did it have some other kind of function, right? Because this is where now I'm going to take a very super interesting turn. So the piezoelectric properties that are properties of crystal within the human brain, in the pineal gland, there are small 150 milligram highly vascularized region of the brain, there are um, these calcite microcrystals that are in the pineal gland. So if you had these ritualistic sites that generate fields of energy, and then you have within you, and we think about like animals that are able to, they know which way the direction north is. It may be have something to do with this very same sort of thing, that in their brain there's these calcite microcrystals, and that now if you're exposed to the fields that are generated, say by these megalithic sites, and you have crystals in your brain at the base of your brain that also have piezoelectric properties because they're crystals. So what it would create a bioelectrical field, and that if you were in that field, would it produce a dreamlike state or an altered state of consciousness, or have some kind of a profound effect on your consciousness? And this goes back to what we were talking about: ether, pneuma, prana, chi, life force. That through breath practices, you could internally apply pressure through these breathing practices that would apply pressure at the pineal from, say, cerebral spinal fluid, that would produce a piezoelectric effect from the crystals, and this would generate a field. And your nervous system's already a biochemical electrical system.
Right, it's completely integrated.
Right. So then if all that stuff's working together, then would that lead to enlightenment? Like, remember
That
or
big
the spiritual experience, or I'm going, isn't that something then that would be worthy of the time to see whether or not there was any truth to it, or that in fact that is, you know.
Well, just as a base, we know that breathing affects our whole body because it's part of the integrated system.
Right, because of its effects on the nervous system, like in terms of relaxing it. But is the mechanical action of breathing then, does it, because the pineal gland sits at the base of the brain, and so if these calcite microcrystals are there, is the mechanical action of breathing putting pressure on them? So then that's what produces an elated, or it produces a field that would produce an elated sensation, or a high, or influence your state of consciousness.
Well, I was going to go through the argument that breathing would have to affect the cerebral spinal fluid if that's the mechanism that. Well, we know it does put pressure on your brain.
Right.
It's just the mechanisms in which.
Well, I think it's a conjunction of like breathing and then bearing down, like think about when you're going to the bathroom. It's those very muscles. Think about it, because when you bear down like that, it creates pressure low in the pelvic region. So what would that do? It would drive the cerebral spinal fluid up the spinal column.
So it's literally a squeezing pressure.
Yeah. Well, and then it's the pressure of the fluid at the base of the brain that might act on those calcite microcrystals, which are crystals. You produce a piezoelectric effect, and then wouldn't that therefore then somehow influence your consciousness?
Well, at least as a rough argument, we know that taking a 10-second breather when you need to, like say you're angry, you take a breather.
But that's its effect on that's the effect it has on the autonomic nervous system, right? That like it influences the autonomic nervous system, like so by pausing, taking a long, slow drawn out breath, causes the autonomic nervous system to go into like what they refer to as a rest and digest phase, where now there's no stress hormones being dumped. Your body starts reabsorbing the stress hormones. You pause. I don't know that's the same thing as.
I just made the connection between hyperventilating, slow breathing, and that at least, well, you say the change in your autonomic nervous system. So I was trying to draw connections between that and the actual action of what's going on in your spinal fluid. I didn't know. I'm just
Yeah,
That was my process.
again, somebody who meditates like as often as I do, and for as long as I have, I can tell you that with a degree of accuracy that the only way that you're gonna be able to apply pressure on those calcimite microcrystals at the base of the brain in the pineal gland would be as a result of like part a breathing technique, but also bearing down and squeezing so that it would produce like the pressure from the cerebral spinal fluid traveling up the spinal column to the base of the brain to apply the mechanical pressure to cause those calcimite crystals to start producing a piezoelectric effect. And then the idea is then, how much of an effect does that have on the brain function itself? And does it potentially alter the chemistry and function of the brain so that you experience spiritual enlightenment or metaphysical union, oneness, wholeness? Isn't that what we were talking about? That's how we opened, right? So you see how it all comes full circle. Now, is it really true?
You could argue that the breathing methods like meditation, squeezing the base of your spine, I'm assuming you didn't make this method. It was something that was there.
It pre-exists, right? I didn't create this. Remember when we talked about chi and ki and how it's closely associated with the martial arts. So you create that bearing down and creating the pressure to produce the mechanical effect, that affects the calcimite microcrystals at the base of the brain. In yoga, right? So they talk about prana and how it produces energy, like it's essentially energy, the essence of what you are. Well, are all those traditions referring to the calcimite crystals at the base of your skull and them being active, and then in their activity they affect the brain function so that you end up having a higher state of consciousness?
It seems like it's been represented that way, at least symbolically.
Okay, so then this might demonstrate that there might be some truth to it, like at least something that measurable truth to it. But again, that would require like research that I'm neither capable of or able to support in any meaningful way, other than to ask the question and to explore it like personally in the way that I do through meditation. But I can't tell you that I've experienced some kind of mystical oneness or union. I don't know. It's not within my experience so far in all these years that I've been meditating. But I'm not sure what it's supposed to feel like. Maybe I do feel it, and I just don't recognize the fact that that's what I'm feeling.
Is it at least calming?
Oh, it's 100% calming.
It sounds like a good thing to have in your back pocket then.
I swear by it. I encourage people to actively do it, but you can lead a horse to water, but you can't make it drink, right? So I simply plant seeds. So maybe you can look at this as a way of sort of encouraging people that there might be some real truth to all of this, and that you might be able to experience it within the context of your everyday life that you lead, right? So maybe there's value in there, but only you could determine that. Only the individual actively pursuing it could do that. Can I get a time check?
Yep, we're 1 hour 33 minutes.
Okay, I think that's a perfectly good place to bring this to a close. Would you agree?
Oh, I wanted to ask, is
Sure.
there any meditators you'd like to bring up?
Not specifically. And the ones who I have, I've already mentioned them, right? But just to be fair, anything written by I can't believe I've forgotten his name already. No.
Is it the Iceman?
No, well, Wim Hof, of course, but Patrick McKeown, and the books written by forgotten his name already. But anyway, I'll definitely remember him when we discuss whales. I'm getting ahead of myself, but so I think that sums up everything. I think in terms of meditation, there's so many different methods that are available to you. Just it's just a matter of starting. Find one that appeals to your sensibilities. It's much like anything that you might actively pursue. Find one that works within the context of you, who you are, and then apply that into your everyday life and see what kind of a positive or negative effect it may or may not have. So I would just like to finish then, I think, by saying question everything, including yourself. And it's a worthy endeavor to spend your life trying to realize yourself as a renegade, individualist, humanist, critical, objective thinker. And until next time, I just want to thank you for being here and have a wonderful day. Thank you so much. Thank you for your time.